2 days before Christmas, my son called and said 8 words that I will never forget for as long as I live. Don't come to dinner. Nadine doesn't want you here. I stood in my kitchen in Fredericton holding the phone, snow coming down outside the window, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment I stop pretending everything is fine. I'm 63 now. My name is Arthur Bellamy, and I've been a carpenter most of my life. I built houses for other people for 35 years, raised 2 kids in a split level on Riverside Drive, watched my marriage to Patricia fall apart slowly, the way old wood rots from the inside out, long before anyone can see it from the outside. When Patricia and I divorced, my son Evan was 26. My daughter Leah was 22. Leah took it hard, but she kept calling. Evan took it differently. He took it personally, like I'd done it to him. That was 7 years before the Christmas phone call. 7 years of carefully maintained distance. 7 years of holidays where I'd drive 3 hours to Moncton and sit at the edge of whatever gathering Evan had organized, feeling like a guest who hadn't been properly invited. 7 years of Nadine looking through me rather than at me. She wasn't cruel in any obvious way. She was just precise about it. The way she'd answer my questions with the minimum possible words. The way she'd leave the room when I arrived. The way Evan's voice changed on the phone when she was nearby. I understood something about Nadine that took me years to admit. She didn't dislike me because I was difficult. She disliked me because I was a reminder that Evan had a life before her. That was enough. The year before that Christmas, I'd sold the house on Riverside Drive. 31 years I'd lived there. I'd built the back deck myself, replaced every window over time, knew every creak in every floorboard. When the sale went through in October, I walked away with $260,000 after paying off what was left on the mortgage. It was more money than I'd ever had in one place. I put $200,000 into a GIC at my credit union and kept the rest liquid. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of Fredericton, close to the river, quieter than I expected. I thought having that money might change something with Evan. Not that I planned to offer it. I wasn't foolish, but I think I believed in some part of myself I'm not proud of, that knowing I had resources would make me feel less like I was approaching him with my hat in my hand. It didn't work that way. 3 weeks before Christmas, I called Evan to ask about the holidays. I asked carefully. I'd learned to be careful with him. Was there a time that might work to come over? Even just for coffee. Even just for an hour. He said he'd check with Nadine. I knew what that meant, but I waited anyway because that's what I'd been doing for 7 years. The call came 2 days before Christmas Eve. Evening, around 7 o'clock, I was making soup. Evan's voice was the way it always was when Nadine was in the room. Clipped, efficient, someone else's voice wearing my son's. He said they were keeping Christmas small this year. Just immediate family. I asked if I wasn't immediate family. That's when he said it. Don't come to dinner. Nadine doesn't want you here. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain what Nadine's reason was, though I doubt there was a reason beyond the usual one, which is that my presence bothered her, and Evan had long since stopped weighing my feelings against hers. He just said it plainly, the way you tell someone their package has been delayed. Matter of fact, not his problem. I said okay. I said I understood. I hung up. I stood at the stove and looked at the soup I was making and thought, you are 62 years old and your son just uninvited you from Christmas because his wife doesn't want you there. And I felt something that surprised me. Not grief, not anger, just a kind of exhaustion. Like I'd been carrying something for a very long time, and my body had finally decided to acknowledge the weight. I called Leah. She lives in Halifax. She answered on the second ring. When I told her what Evan had said, there was a silence on her end that told me this didn't entirely surprise her. She said some things about Nadine that were honest and not particularly kind, and I let her say them because she needed to. Then she said, Dad, you don't have to be alone on Christmas. Come here. I told her I'd think about it. I didn't want to be a burden. That's the lie I'd been telling myself for years. Their reaching out was the same as being a burden. I'd gotten very good at declining invitations to protect people from having to mean them. What I did instead, because the weather forecast looked bad for the drive to Halifax, and I wasn't ready to be around family energy, even loving family energy, was make a reservation at a restaurant downtown for Christmas Eve dinner. Just me. A table for one, the Garrison Room on Queen Street. The kind of place that does a proper roast beef on the holidays. The kind of restaurant that treats a man eating alone with dignity instead of pity. I got there at 6:30. The room was full in that particular way. Restaurants are on Christmas Eve. Families, couples, a few groups of friends. Everyone lit up with the particular brightness that comes from choosing to be somewhere rather than being obligated to be there. I ordered the roast beef and a glass of red wine and told myself I was fine. I wasn't fine. I wasn't falling apart, but I wasn't fine. I kept thinking about Evan as a little boy. He used to follow me around when I was working on the house, hand me tools before I asked for them. He learned the names of everything: joist hanger, chalk line, wood chisel. He was proud of knowing. When did that boy become someone who delivered his wife's decisions over the phone without apology? I was somewhere in the middle of thinking this when the woman at the table beside me said, quietly, "Excuse me." She was older than me by a few years, I guessed. White hair, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She had the look of someone who had been handsome her whole life and had stopped being particularly interested in it. Sitting with her was a man about her age and a younger couple, son and daughter-in-law, I'd later learn. She said, "I couldn't help but notice you're alone tonight. My family and I would be very happy if you joined us." Just like that. Not pitying. Not performing. Just stating an offer the way you'd state any fact. I said I didn't want to intrude. She said, "You're not intruding. We're inviting you." There's a difference. Her name was Beverly Okafor. Her husband was Leonard. Their son was Patrick, and his wife was Diane. They were from Fredericton, same as me, though we'd never crossed paths. Beverly had grown up in New Brunswick, gone to UNB, taught elementary school for 30 years. Leonard had worked for the provincial government in natural resources. They had the ease of two people who had been happy together for a long time. Not the performing kind of happy, just the settled kind, where you don't need to prove anything. I joined them. I don't know how else to say what the next 2 hours were like, except that it felt like being let back into a room I hadn't realized I'd been locked out of. They asked me questions and actually listened to the answers. Beverly had a way of following up on things you said, not to be polite, but because she genuinely filed it away and wanted to know more. Leonard and I talked about carpentry, and he showed me his hands, which were rough the way working hands are, and said he'd done a lot of work around the house himself over the years. Patrick had his mother's directness. Diane had the kind of laugh that made everything feel lighter. At some point during dessert, Beverly looked at me and said, "What are you doing for the rest of the week?" I said not much, the honest answer. She said they did a family supper every Sunday. Nothing fancy. "Come this Sunday if you like." I said I didn't want to impose. Lynn had said, "You'd actually be doing us a favor." Beverly always makes too much food and it goes to waste. She looked at him and said that was not strictly true, but she smiled. I wrote down their address on a napkin because I didn't have anything else to write on. Beverly had neat handwriting, clear numbers. Driving home that night, I thought about Evan. I thought about Nadine. And then I stopped thinking about them because something had shifted, just slightly, and I didn't want to waste it on people who'd chosen not to be there. Sunday came. I arrived at the Okafor's house at 5 to 6 with a bottle of Chateau des Charmes from the LCBO and a box of those butter tarts from the bakery on Regent that everyone in Fredericton agrees are the best ones. Beverly opened the door before I knocked. She said, "I was wondering if you'd come." I said, "I almost didn't." She said, "But you did." That was the whole conversation. She stood back and let me in. Over the next 6 months, Sunday suppers became the structure my week was organized around. I'd spend the week doing whatever I did, taking on the odd small carpentry job because I couldn't quite let it go. Reading, walking along the river trail, and Sunday was the thing I was moving toward. Beverly's cooking was the kind that took all day. Pot roast, tourtière in winter, salmon in summer. Always too much bread. Always coffee after. Leonard would show me whatever project he was working on in the garage, and we'd talk about it seriously. The way people talk about things they actually care about. Patrick and Diane came most Sundays. Their daughter, Rosie, was 4, decided early on that I was interesting and would bring me things to look at. Rocks, drawings, a beetle she'd found, once a very small piece of wood that she said was a boat. I started bringing things to fix when I came. A loose hinge on Beverly's pantry door, a window in the upstairs bathroom that had started to stick. Leonard's workbench that needed reinforcing. They didn't ask me to. I just noticed things and fixed them because it was what I knew how to do and because it felt like a language I could speak when I didn't have other words. By month 3, I had a designated mug at the Okafor house. White with a chip on the handle that Beverly had put a small piece of tape over. She said it was still perfectly good. I agreed. By month 4, Rosie had started calling me Grandpa Art. I wasn't ready for that. I stood there the first time she said it, and felt something happen in my chest that I don't have a name for. Beverly watched me and didn't make a thing of it, which was exactly right. I called Leah that evening. I told her about Rosie, about the Okafors, about the Sunday suppers. There was a silence on her end that was a different kind than the silence when I told her about Evan's Christmas call. This one was softer. She said, "Dad, I'm really glad." I said I was too. She said, "I want to meet them sometime." I said I thought that could be arranged. 3 months after my first Sunday supper, Evan called. I was in the middle of replacing a section of fence board in my apartment building's back area. The property manager had asked if I'd take a look, and I said, sure, it gave me something to do. My phone rang, and I looked at the screen and stood there for a moment before answering. His voice was different than the Christmas call. Uncertain, somehow. Smaller. He said he'd been thinking about things. He said he knew Christmas had been hard, and he was sorry about that. He said maybe we could get together, grab a coffee, catch up. I said sure. I said that would be good. We met at a cafe in Moncton on a Thursday, halfway between our 2 cities. I drove the hour and a half without expectations, or I tried to. I got there first and ordered tea and sat by the window and watched the street. Evan arrived 8 minutes late. Which is Evan, he's always been 8 minutes late his whole life. It's the one consistent thing. He looked older. Not badly, just more worn. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at Christmas. His jacket was the expensive kind Nadine had always pushed him toward. He sat down and ordered a coffee, and we talked about neutral things for 20 minutes. How was Fredericton? How was the apartment? How was Leah? Then he said, I wanted to talk to you about something. I waited. He said he and Nadine had made some investments over the past couple of years. A friend of a friend had brought them in on something. A rental property development outside Halifax. Very solid projections. Good returns on paper, but things had shifted. The developer had run into trouble. There were delays, then cost overruns, then something regulatory. Long story short, they'd put in $70,000, and they weren't going to see it back. He stopped and looked at his coffee. I said, Evan, how much do you need? He said, 50,000. He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed. He said it with a framework around it. They'd talked to their financial advisor. They had a plan to pay it back. This was just to bridge the gap, while they sorted out what they could recover from the developer. He said Nadine's parents had already contributed what they could. He said he hated asking. I looked at my son across the table. He was 40 years old. He had a good job managing logistics for a distribution company. He had a house in Moncton that Nadine had decorated to look like a magazine. He had everything that looked like success from the outside. I said, I'm not going to do that. He started to speak. I said, let me finish. I said, I'm not going to give you $50,000. Not because I don't have it. You probably know I sold the house and you've done the math. But, Evan, 2 days before Christmas, You called me and told me not to come to dinner because your wife didn't want me there. I didn't argue. I said okay, and I went and had Christmas Eve dinner by myself. And I've been thinking about that since. About what kind of father accepts that, about what kind of son says it. He said, "That's not fair. You know what Nadine's like. You know I didn't have a choice." I said, "You had a choice. You've always had a choice. You chose her version of things every single time. And I'm not saying that to punish you. I'm saying it because I think you need to hear it from someone who's watched it happen for 7 years." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So that's it. You're holding Christmas over me to justify not helping." I said, "I'm not holding anything over you. I'm telling you where I am. I'm 62 years old, and I've spent 7 years making myself small so that your wife would be comfortable and you wouldn't have to choose. I'm done doing that. If you want a real relationship, I'm here for that, but I'm not going to be someone you call when the investment goes bad." He said, "I can't believe this." I said, "I can't believe it." That's the difference between us right now. He left 20 minutes later. Not dramatically. Evan doesn't do dramatic. He just said he had to get back. It was a long drive. He'd think about what I'd said. I watched him walk to his car. I sat at the table for a while after that, finishing my tea, watching the street. I called Beverly from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring. I said, "I just had coffee with my son." She said, "How did it go?" I said, "He asked me for $50,000. A pause. "Then, did you say yes?" I said, "No." Another pause. Then, "Good. Come for supper Sunday." Leonard is making his chili. I drove back to Fredericton with the radio on. The highway through the winter trees, bare and gray and still standing. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was steady. Not happy, not sad, just steady. 3 weeks later, Evan called again. I was in Beverly's kitchen, helping her get ahead on Saturday prep, chopping onions while she worked on stock. Leonard was in the garage. Rosie was at the kitchen table drawing something she said was a horse, but was actually, we both agreed privately, more of a very enthusiastic cloud. My phone buzzed on the counter. "Evan." Beverly glanced at the screen and then at me. I picked it up and stepped into the hallway. He didn't build up to it this time. He said the deal had completely fallen through. He said they owed money to Nadine's father on top of the original loss. He said Nadine was not doing well. He said if I ever had any interest in being part of his life, I would do this one thing, just this one thing, and then we could move forward. I said, "Evan?" "The answer is the same." He said, "Do you understand what you're doing to this family?" I said, "I understand what's happened to this family, but I didn't cause it and I can't fix it by writing a check." He said some things then that were hard to hear. He said I'd always put myself first. He said the divorce had proven that, moving to Fredericton had proven that, and now this was proving it again. He said Nadine had been right about me from the beginning. I let him talk. When he finished, I said, "I love you, Evan. That hasn't changed. But I won't be doing this." He said, "Then don't call me." I said, "Okay." He hung up. I stood in Beverly's hallway for a moment, looking at the wall where she'd hung a collection of small framed photos. Decades of Christmases and Easters and random Tuesdays, all these people choosing each other over and over. Then I went back to the kitchen and picked up my knife and kept chopping. Beverly didn't ask. She just moved the cutting board a little closer to me and kept working on her stock. After a few minutes, Rosie held up her drawing. She said, "Grandpa Art, does this look like a horse?" I looked at it seriously. I said, "It looks like the idea of a horse. I think that's actually better." She considered this. Then she nodded, satisfied, and went back to drawing. That was the last time I heard from Evan for 4 years. 4 years. Not a text, not an email, not a card at Christmas. Leah stayed in touch with him, quietly, the way she'd always navigated between us. She told me he and Nadine had sold their house in Moncton and moved to a smaller place in Riverview. that Nadine's father had covered most of what they owed, and the relationship there was complicated now. She told me he was doing okay, working, getting on with it. She didn't tell me more than that, and I didn't ask. My life in those 4 years was fuller than it had been in a decade. Sunday suppers. Carpentry jobs. I took for the interest of them, not the money. A hiking club I joined through the city recreation program, mostly retired people. Good company. Leah came to visit twice and stayed with me both times, and the second time she brought her boyfriend Thomas, who was a veterinarian and asked me about carpentry with genuine curiosity, and by the end of the weekend, I decided I liked him. Rosie grew from 4 to 8 and started calling me Grandpa Art in the comfortable way of someone for whom this has always simply been true. Beverly had a health scare in the 3rd year. Something cardiac, caught early, managed with medication and a fairly significant change in how much butter went into things. Leonard didn't handle the fear well at first. He called me one afternoon from the hospital parking lot while Beverly was having tests, and I drove over and sat with him in the car in the parking garage, and we talked about nothing in particular for 2 hours, which was exactly what he needed. He told me later that he didn't know how he'd have gotten through it without me there. I told him it was nothing. He said, "Don't say that. It wasn't nothing." The Sunday suppers continued through all of it. Leah told me about her engagement to Thomas on a Sunday afternoon. I was at the Okafors. She called from Halifax. She said she wanted to tell me first before anyone else. I sat at Beverly's kitchen table and I cried a little, which I'm not embarrassed about. Beverly put a cup of tea in front of me and squeezed my shoulder, and I could hear her smiling. She wanted a late September wedding, a venue outside of Halifax, overlooking the water. She said she was inviting everyone, and then she paused and said, "Dad, I invited Evan." I said, "I know. He's your brother." She said, "He might not come." "I don't know." I said, "That's his choice to make." She said, "Are you okay with it? With him being there if he comes?" I said, "Leah, this is your wedding. You don't need my permission for anything that happens at it." She said, "I'm not asking permission. I'm asking if you're okay." I thought about that. I said, "I think I'm okay with most things now." The venue was a property on the South Shore, white farmhouse, a field that ran down to the water, strings of lights in the trees for the evening. The kind of place that looks like it was built for exactly this. Thomas had family from Ontario and British Columbia, so there were people there who'd flown in, which gave the whole thing that particular energy of an occasion people had made effort for. I stood beside Beverly and Leonard during the ceremony, and Rosie was beside us in a dress she'd declared the best dress ever made, and I watched my daughter walk toward the man she'd chosen, and I thought, This is what it was all for. When Leah and Thomas were pronounced married, the field erupted in the kind of sound that only happens when people are genuinely happy about something. At the reception, I found my place card at a table with the Okafors and Thomas's parents, a couple from Kingston, who turned out to be warm and funny, and we drank Nova Scotia wine and ate cedar plank salmon, and I don't think I stopped smiling for 3 hours. It was Beverly who noticed him first. She leaned toward me during the dinner and said quietly, "Arthur, I think that might be Evan." I looked where she was indicating. He was standing near the edge of the tent, still in his jacket, hadn't sat down yet. He looked like a man who had driven a long way and wasn't sure he should have. He was thinner than I remembered. His hair was shorter. He had the look of someone who had been through something difficult and was still sorting out who he was on the other side of it. He was watching our table. I excused myself and walked toward him. When he saw me coming, he didn't move. I said, "Evan." He said, "Dad." We looked at each other. 4 years is a long time. It's also not very long at all. He said, "Leah said you might be angry I came." I said, "This is your sister's wedding. Of course you came." He said, "I almost didn't." I said, "I know." He looked past me toward the table where Beverly and Leonard were watching us. Not staring, just aware. He said, "Are those them? The people you mentioned?" Leah told me a bit. I said, "Yes. That's Beverly and Leonard." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She said you found a family." I said, I found people who showed up for me. That's what family turned out to mean. Evan looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him in a very long time. Not anger, not the careful blankness he'd cultivated around me for years. Something more exposed than that. More honest. He said, I handled things badly. For a long time. I said, you did. He said, I don't know if I can fix it. I said, I don't know either. But I'm not going anywhere. If you want to figure it out, I'm here. He stood there for a moment. Then he said, Nadine and I separated. 8 months ago. I said I was sorry to hear that. I meant it. Whatever Nadine had been to me, she was still his marriage, still years of his life. He said she's not. She's okay. We're both okay. It just didn't work anymore. I said, I'm sorry, son. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. He said, you called me son. I said, you are my son. That part didn't change. We stood together at the edge of Leah's wedding reception while the band played something from the 70s and Rosie dragged Leonard onto the dance floor. And Beverly laughed at the look on his face. I didn't offer Evan a reconciliation speech. I didn't summarize what I'd learned or tell him I forgave him. I just stood there with him the way you stand with someone, when you're not sure yet what comes next, but you've agreed to find out. After a while, I said, come and meet some people. He followed me back to the table. 3 weeks after Leah's wedding, I was at Sunday supper when Beverly asked me to say something. She started this tradition a while back. Just a few words, nothing formal. Whatever had been on your mind during the week, I'd never been comfortable with it at first. I was a man who built things, not a man who made speeches. But I'd gotten better at it. I said, I've been thinking about doors. I spent a lot of years standing outside a door and knocking and wondering why nobody was answering, and assuming the problem was me. The way I knocked, or when I knocked, or what I was wearing, I kept adjusting. I kept trying different approaches. I never thought to stop and look around and notice that there were other doors on other houses with lights on and people inside. I looked at Beverly and Leonard. I looked at Patrick and Diane. I looked at Rosie, who had a piece of bread in each hand and was listening politely. I said, you opened a door on Christmas Eve and asked a stranger to sit down. That's a small thing, and it's the biggest thing that's happened to me in 20 years. Leonard said gruffly, you brought good wine. We were always going to let you in. Beverly said, Leonard. He said, I'm serious. The Chateau des Champs was excellent. Everyone laughed, even me. Later, sitting on the Okafor's back porch with a cup of coffee while Leonard checked on something in the garage, Beverly sat beside me in the other chair, and we listened to the autumn sounds of the neighborhood, a dog somewhere, a car, the particular silence of a Canadian October evening that feels like the world taking a breath before winter. She said, how is Evan? I said, we've talked a few times since the wedding. It's careful. We're both being careful. But it's something. She said, that's good. I said, I don't know what it will be. She said, you don't have to know yet. I thought about Evan as a boy, handing me tools in the order I'd need them. I thought about the Christmas call. I thought about him standing at the edge of Leah's wedding, deciding whether to come all the way in. I thought about how much of life turns on whether you decide to cross a threshold. Beverly reached over and patted my hand once. The way she did sometimes. The way that meant, I see you. You're fine. We're here. The night was clear. You could see stars over the Fredericton tree line, which you can do in October if you're paying attention. I finished my coffee. Next Sunday was already something I was looking forward to. There are things I know now that I didn't know 5 years ago. I know that love doesn't mean you accept whatever someone gives you and call it enough. I know that chosen family isn't a consolation prize. It's sometimes the real thing, more real than what you were born into. I know that you can be 62 years old, alone on Christmas Eve, and have your whole life rearrange itself because a woman at the next table decided you mattered. I know that doors work in both directions. You can stop knocking on the ones that don't open, and you can walk through the ones that do. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out what it actually taught me. Not the lesson I would have written down in the middle of it. Because in the middle of it, I mostly just felt tired. I mean what it taught me once I had enough distance to look back clearly. The first thing I know is that what you accept becomes what people offer you. For 7 years, I accepted being an inconvenience. I showed up carefully, I made myself small, I said okay when I meant anything but okay. And every time I did that, I was quietly telling Evan and Nadine that this was the arrangement, that this was what a relationship with me looked like, something that happened on their terms, in their time, when it suited them. I'm not saying it was my fault. I'm saying I participated in it longer than I should have. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to understand it. The second thing is about what happens when you stop. When I finally said no to Evan at that cafe in Moncton, when I told him I wouldn't be writing a check to clean up a mess I hadn't made, something shifted that I didn't fully understand until later. It wasn't just that I'd said no to $50,000. I'd said no to the whole arrangement. I'd said, I'm not available to be used, and the remarkable thing, the thing I wasn't prepared for, is that once you say it, clearly and without anger, the people who are only there for what you could give them tend to fall quiet, and the people who were there because they actually valued you tend to stay. Beverly stayed. Leonard stayed. Rosie, who called me Grandpa Art before she was old enough to understand what that meant, stayed. Leah had always stayed, but once I stopped shrinking myself, our relationship got bigger, more honest, more real. These things don't happen by accident. They happen because of choices, accumulated over time. Beverly's choice to cross a restaurant on Christmas Eve, my choice to say yes, and then my choice to show up the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. What Evan lost, he lost through his own choices too. I don't say that with any satisfaction. He's my son. Watching him stand at the edge of Leah's wedding, looking at the family I'd built without him, was one of the harder things I've experienced. But consequences are honest in a way that feelings sometimes aren't. The 4 years of silence weren't something that happened to him. They were something he constructed, decision by decision. The same way I built things out of wood for 35 years, piece by piece, until the shape of it was clear. What I want to say to anyone who recognizes themselves in this: maybe you're the parent who keeps reaching out and getting nothing back, or maybe you're the one who's been showing up for someone who takes it for granted, is just this: the door you keep knocking on is not the only door. There are other houses. There are people who will see you clearly and decide, without owing you anything, that you matter. That kind of recognition, when you find it, changes what you understand about yourself. I'm 63. I've got a designated mug at someone else's kitchen table, and a little girl who thinks I'm her grandfather. I've got my daughter married and happy, and a son I'm carefully, slowly getting to know again. None of it looks like what I expected my life to look like. It's better, actually, quite a bit better.